Hello everyone, my name is Bilal Hashmi from cloudbuddy.com, and today we'll be going over HA admission control policies and how it impacts cluster capacity. This brief demo assumes that you are a VMware admin and you have knowledge about HA and its inner workings, the different HA admission control policies, and lastly, you have a very good understanding of how these admission policies can impact your cluster capacity. So, before we really get into it, I wanted to give you guys a rundown of what my environment or my lab is set up. Like, this is the cluster, this is my lab, this is the cluster that we'll be working with today. It's called vCloud. My vCloud cluster has 2 hosts, each of which have 2 logical processors and 6 gigs of memory. I have that many VMs in my cluster with none of those VMs having any kinds of reservation. Let's take a look at my admission policies, which is right here. I'm using percentage of cluster resources reserved as 10% for CPU and 10% for memory. What that really means is that I'm basically reserving 10% of my cluster capacity for an HA event. So now, well, let me go back there just a second and take a look at this. We already know that there are 3 different methods or 3 different policies that can be utilized, each of which has its own advantages and disadvantages depending on what problem we are really trying to solve. Now, the scope of this video is really not to discuss that. However, we do know to understand each one of this and how it impacts, there is a great deal of calculation and understanding that goes behind this. And sometimes it becomes a really important part of the whole design of what's being implemented. There are numerous blogs out there that have discussed it. I myself have personally written a bunch of articles on my blog, and so have many bloggers around the world. In fact, one of the best resources to understand the inner workings of HA is the HADRS Deep Dive series of books from Duncan and Frank. So it's one thing to know how these things really work. And it's great that we all know that we can calculate what our slot sizes should be if you want to run X number of VMs and whatnot. But let me ask you this. When you are doing your budgets, do you use a calculator, some kind of a software, some kind of a tool, or do you do it all in your head? And I hope the answer is that you use some kind of a tool. Same applies for calculating these numbers. Why go through the whole effort of coming up with what policy to use, what numbers to plug in, when we already have a tool that does it for us? In comes CloudPhysics. And CloudPhysics, what is it? Well, I first heard about the company last year. Now let me point out they do a lot more than just simple HA calculations. The HA calculation is just one of the very small things that they do, but for our purposes, that's what we'll focus on. So where do we start? Well, you go to cloudphysics.com and then you enter your credentials, which I'm doing right now. And once you enter, you'll notice that CloudPhysics knows a lot about my lab. Well, how is that? Good question. Well, the way CloudPhysics works is it basically has an appliance that you deploy in your environment. You then give it an IP address. You then tell it what your CloudPhysics credentials are, and then give it the credentials to access the information from your vCenter. It will then send the information back to CloudPhysics, and that's how the magic happens. Very simple deployment. I think their deployment instructions are about a page long, and you will absolutely never ever need them. So here, what we are looking at is a dashboard, which is really a bunch of cards. That's what they call them. And the card that we are interested in is called the HA simulation. Once you come into here, you'll notice that it already knows the cluster that we're working with, vCloud. It knows I have 3 VMs that are powered on. I have 2 hosts that are in that cluster, and that's what my cluster looks like. I have about that much of available CPU resources, and that much on top is what's reserved by HA. Same thing for my memory. Great. So also the other thing is right here. Currently out of the 12 gigs or 12 or some gigs that I had, I have about 11.8 gigs that I can very easily use. Oh, I'm sorry. Out of the 12 gigs of memory, I have about 11 gigs available for running VMs, and about 1 gig is what's being reserved by HA. So what if I wanted to change that? So what I do is I come down here to the simulate a new policy, and I say, hey, that's the method I've been using, and I want to find out what happens if I change that number to 25. Ta-da! As you will notice, it's now telling me that my reservable or available VM capacity has gone down. Now HA wants to reserve more, and I am down 17% because I've increased the amount of memory that I want to reserve. Same thing can be used for the CPU. And of course, if you want to have a little bit of fun with it, you can, figure out, hey, what if I want to reserve 50%? Hey, I want to reserve 80%. I don't know why you would want to do that, but if that's what you want to do, be my guest. That's not it. Now, you decide, hey, I have been running one particular method. I want to play around with tolerate n number of hosts and see how that changes. Well, one thing you notice right off the bat, as soon as you change that, it tells you how many number of VMs you can really run, and I think that's very, very helpful. But how is it coming up with that number? Well, as you already know, this method uses slot sizes, and that's dependent on the amount of reservations, if you have any reservations or you don't. As of now, I have no reservations. I have 3 VMs, no reservations for CPU, no reservations for memory, which is why I'm able to run that crazy number. Now, what if I have one VM? I have one VM that requires a 1 gig memory reservation. And I'm just simulating this. Nothing is changing for real. I say, hey, I have one VM that may need a reservation for 1 gig. If I do that and use that policy, how many VMs can I really run? And over here, you'll notice that has changed to 3. That is absolutely great information to have, which I think would take a long time if you were to sit down and figure it out. If I only needed, let's say, about 550 megs of memory reserved, I can run 5 VMs, but that number is way lower than 123 that we originally thought, which I thought was a crazy number anyways. You can also go and simulate the designated failover host, which I think is pretty straightforward, but it's there if you want to play around with it. That's just one of the features of what CloudPhysics has to offer. There are many more things that CloudPhysics does, and I hope by watching this brief demo you were able to understand the power of this tool and appreciate the simplistic approach of solving such a very complex problem in such an elegant way. I encourage you to take this for a spin and test it yourself, and I'm sure you'll be glad you did. So now, let's try and wrap up. Today we touched the topic of complexity that's involved in computing reserved and available capacity and how it's impacted by our admission control settings. We then quickly reviewed how a tool like CloudPhysics can come in and help us find the sweet spot without a lot of effort. I hope you've learned something new and interesting today. And with that, I would like to sign off. Once again, this is Bilal Hashmi from cloudbuddy.com. I thank you for taking the time to watch this demo. Have a great day.